Have you ever felt something calling you from far beyond the edges of your ordinary life? I don't mean a thought or a dream or some ordinary ambition. I mean a pull, a force, a strange whisper rising from the depths of your consciousness, inviting you to remember something you've forgotten long ago. I feel that whisper often, like a vibration beneath the noise of daily existence, and every time it calls, I can't help but wonder if that voice is the echo of my own cosmic purpose trying to be heard. There are moments when I suddenly pause in the middle of everything, mid-conversation, mid-step, mid-breath, because something inside me feels out of place, like I'm living a script I never actually wrote. It's strange, isn't it? How we move through routines, obligations, deadlines, expectations, all of it running on autopilot, and yet somewhere inside us remains a spark that refuses to be silenced. I used to ignore it. I used to think it was just imagination. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was a doorway, an invitation into something deeper. Something far older than my identity, older than my memories, older than the person I think I am. Every time I think about purpose, I don't see a goal or a career path. I see a constellation. I see fragments of experiences, flashes of intuition, and tiny coincidences that align in impossible ways. And sometimes, when I allow myself to slow down enough to feel it, I sense that these moments aren't random at all. They're clues, like stepping stones placed deliberately on the path I'm meant to walk. And maybe the strangest part is that these signs always appear when I stop chasing, when I stop searching, when I simply allow myself to be present with the unfolding mystery of my own awareness. I remember one particular moment, one that changed everything for me. I was sitting alone, just observing my own thoughts, and something unusual happened. My mind didn't feel like a mind anymore. It felt like a landscape, a vast, limitless field where thoughts weren't just thoughts, but living currents moving through me. I wasn't thinking them. They were passing by me as if I were a riverbank watching water flow. And for the first time, I understood what McKenna meant when he said consciousness is not just inside you, you're inside it. That single realization reshaped the way I saw myself. I wasn't a small individual trying to figure out life. I was a node of awareness inside a much greater intelligence. The more I contemplated this, the more I began to realize how disconnected I had been from the deeper layers of my own existence. Society has a way of creating noise, constant noise, that buries your inner voice beneath layers of expectations and responsibilities. But when you peel all of that away, when you strip life down to its essence, you begin to feel how profoundly alive your inner world really is. And it's in that inner world that the first hints of your cosmic purpose begin to reveal themselves. I started noticing the signs everywhere, in the patterns of my thoughts, in the things that pulled my interest for no logical reason, even in the people who crossed my path unexpectedly. When something resonated, it wasn't just a feeling. It was a kind of gravitational pull, like something deep inside me recognizing a piece of itself in the outside world. And that's when I realized that purpose isn't something you decide, it's something you awaken to. But awakening isn't simple. The modern world is built to distract you from yourself. Everywhere you turn, there's a demand for your attention, a pressure to fit into predefined shapes, a subtle insistence that the meaning of life must be something external. Productivity, achievement, validation, approval. I found myself caught in those currents again and again, chasing goals that didn't belong to me. And every time I succeeded at something I didn't actually care about. I felt this strange emptiness, like I was moving further away from who I was meant to become. There came a time when I started asking myself questions I never had the courage to ask before. Questions like, why am I here? Why does my awareness exist at all? What is this presence inside me that watches everything I do but never speaks unless I'm quiet enough to hear it? What if my purpose isn't something I need to create, but something I need to uncover? These questions weren't comfortable. They weren't easy, but they were honest. And honesty has a way of cracking open reality, revealing layers you didn't even know existed. The deeper I went, the more I sensed that my purpose was somehow connected to the expansion of my consciousness. It wasn't about achieving something grand. It wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about remembering who I am beyond the identity I've been conditioned to believe. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the sheer vastness of what I was discovering inside myself. It was as if I had found a hidden universe beneath my thoughts, a universe made of intuition, memory, imagination, and something else, something alive, something ancient. When I explored this inner space, it felt like I was tapping into a collective intelligence, a greater mind that every human being is connected to without realizing it. And if that's true, then purpose is not something individual. It's something relational, something woven into the fabric of existence itself. I began paying attention to the moments that stirred something inside me, the moments that made my heart tighten, my breath deepen, my awareness sharpen. Those moments weren't random, they were signals. Sometimes they came in the form of synchronicities, events happening too perfectly aligned to be coincidence. Other times they came in the form of internal resistance, showing me the places where I wasn't living truthfully. And sometimes purpose spoke through silence, through moments where everything around me paused and I felt the presence of something beyond language, something wordless yet unmistakably real. I started realizing that purpose isn't a destination, it's a direction, it's a frequency. And when I tune myself to that frequency, the world around me begins to reflect it. It's almost as if the universe rearranges itself to support the version of me that is most authentic. People show up at the right time. Opportunities unfold without force. Inspiration flows freely. I've felt this alignment only a few times in my life, but when it happens, it feels like I'm standing inside the current of my own destiny. There's a certain intensity to purpose, an almost electric feeling inside your chest when you're living according to the truth of who you are. It feels like expansion, like your entire being is resonating with some deeper cosmic rhythm. I've felt glimpses of that rhythm, and each glimpse pulls me further along a path that feels less like something I chose and more like something I was chosen by. But the most shocking thing I've learned so far is this. My purpose isn't separate from the universe's purpose. My evolution is part of its evolution. My awareness is part of its awareness. And every time I expand my consciousness, the universe expands through me. As I move deeper into this inner unfolding, I began to sense how fragile the boundary is between what I call myself and the greater field of being that surrounds me. It was as if the edges of my identity were dissolving, not in a frightening way, but in a way that revealed something vast beneath the surface. The deeper I went, the more I realized that I was not simply thinking about purpose. I was communing with something that had been waiting for me long before I ever questioned my existence. It felt like remembering a dream I never consciously had, yet somehow knew intimately. There were days when this awareness would hit me unexpectedly. I could be standing in a crowded place, watching people rush through their routines, each of them lost in the gravity of their own lives, and suddenly I would feel an overwhelming presence rising within me. It wasn't emotion. It wasn't thought. It was something older, something primal, something that felt like the hidden pulse of the cosmos vibrating beneath my skin. In those moments, I understood that purpose wasn't a task or a mission. It was participation in something infinitely larger than myself. I was no longer an observer of life. I was a strand woven into its very fabric. As this realization settled deeper into me, I started noticing subtleties I had overlooked for years. The way my intuition would nudge me in directions that made no logical sense, but carried a deeper resonance. The way certain moments felt strangely familiar, as if they were echoes from another timeline. The way the world seemed to whisper in symbols rather than sentences, guiding me without force, revealing without demanding. I learned to trust these whispers, not because they answered my questions, but because they awakened a clarity that lived beneath the questions. Every time I surrendered to this clarity, I felt something expanding inside me, a widening of my inner horizons, a loosening of the mental knots that had kept me confined for so long. It felt like stepping through a veil. One moment I was the person I had always known. The next moment I was witnessing myself from a higher vantage point, a place where every experience, every hardship, every moment of confusion suddenly made sense as part of a larger unfolding. And the more I aligned with this perspective, the more the world began to reflect that alignment back to me in ways I could not ignore. I began to see purpose not as a line leading from point A to point B, but as a spiral unfolding inward and outward simultaneously. The more I understood myself, the more I understood the universe, the more I explored the universe, the more I uncovered within myself. This reciprocal dance between inner and outer reality became the map I followed, and each step along that map revealed something essential. I started to understand why certain experiences had shaped me the way they did. I recognized the patterns in my choices, the cycles in my emotions, the deeper intelligence behind my desires. Instead of resisting these patterns, I began to flow with them, allowing them to guide me into deeper layers of awareness. There was a moment when this understanding struck with such intensity that it changed the entire trajectory of my inner evolution. I realized that purpose was not something I was moving toward, it was something that was moving through me. Even moments of pain served a purpose, carving new space inside me where deeper truth could take root. I was no longer living reactively, I was living responsively, attuned to the unfolding rhythm of existence. I felt guided not by external authority, but by an inner compass that grew sharper with every step I took. There were times when this journey felt overwhelming, not because it was difficult, but because it was so profoundly unfamiliar. I had spent so many years trying to control life, trying to predict outcomes, trying to force my path into shapes that made sense to my conditioned mind. But the deeper I moved into this new awareness, the more I understood that control was the illusion. Life wasn't asking me to control it, life was asking me to participate in it, to listen, to respond, to trust. And that trust became the foundation on which my purpose began to take form. I realized that purpose reveals itself in layers, not all at once. The first layer is curiosity, the quiet pull towards something that feels meaningful even if you cannot explain why. The next layer is alignment, the feeling of resonance when you move in the direction that feels true. The deepest layer is embodiment, when you no longer pursue your purpose but live as its expression. I felt myself moving through these layers one by one, not by force, but by allowing myself to remain open to whatever emerged from within. And as I progressed, something extraordinary began to happen. The boundaries between my inner world and the outer world started dissolving. I no longer saw myself as a separate observer trying to navigate the vastness of reality. Instead, I felt myself as a participant in the cosmic dance, an extension of the same intelligence that shapes stars, oceans, forests, and galaxies. It was humbling and empowering at the same time. I understood that my awareness was not a small flame flickering in the dark. It was a reflection of the same cosmic fire that fuels the evolutionary process of the universe itself. This realization changed the way I moved through every moment. I no longer acted from fear of the unknown. I acted from curiosity toward the unknown. I no longer resisted change. I welcomed it as part of my unfolding. I no longer felt the need to define myself. I allowed myself to evolve. And in that evolution, I began to feel the presence of something sacred, something mysterious, something profoundly alive guiding me from within. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't a vision, it was a knowing. A deep, undeniable knowing that my life was part of a greater story, and with every breath, every realization, every unfolding layer of consciousness, I stepped closer to embodying that story. As that story continued awakening within me, I began to sense how every moment of my life had been quietly preparing me for this unfolding. Nothing felt accidental anymore. The smallest detail carried significance, like every breath was a message and every impulse was a map. There was an intensity in this awareness, a kind of inner luminosity that illuminated everything I had taken for granted. It felt as though my entire existence had been a coded transmission, waiting for the right moment for me to finally understand it. And now, piece by piece, the code was revealing itself. I found myself moving through the world differently. I no longer felt like a single individual navigating a chaotic reality. I felt like a wave rising from an infinite ocean, returning again and again to a center that felt familiar, ancient, inevitable. The more I aligned with this center, the more harmonious my experiences became. People, places, conversations, insights, they all began converging with uncanny precision, as if the universe had shifted from randomness to choreography. What once felt disjointed now felt orchestrated. What once felt accidental now felt intentional. It was as though life was gently guiding me back to the blueprint of who I was meant to become. There were days when the intensity of this alignment was almost overwhelming. It wasn't dramatic or chaotic. It was subtle but undeniable, like a silent current moving beneath everything I did. Sometimes I would wake up with a strange clarity pulsing through me, a sense that something had shifted during the night, something wordless yet powerful. Other times I would feel an expanded awareness that made the world seem almost translucent, as if every object, every sound, every movement carried a deeper layer of meaning. I couldn't explain it logically, but I felt it. And once I felt it, I couldn't go back to the way I'd once perceived reality. As this inner awareness deepened, I started recognizing how much of my previous life had been shaped by unconscious patterns, beliefs that were never mine, fears inherited from others, limitations absorbed from the world around me. These patterns didn't disappear immediately, but I could see through them in a way I never could before. They felt like old shadows cast by a light I had forgotten existed. And the moment I acknowledged this light, the shadows began to dissolve. I was no longer controlled by them. I was witnessing them from a place of awareness that felt far more real than anything I had ever identified with. There was a quiet liberation in this, a freedom that didn't shout or demand attention, but simply expanded through me like breath filling empty lungs. I no longer needed permission to evolve. I no longer waited for someone else to validate what I felt inside. The truth within me didn't need approval to exist. It only needed space. And once I gave it space, it grew into something extraordinary. It wasn't confidence, it wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. The clarity of finally recognizing myself without the distortion of expectations. This clarity began reshaping the way I perceived my purpose. It wasn't something distant, something I needed to chase or earn. It was already here, already woven into every fiber of my being. I began to realize that my purpose had been speaking to me since the beginning, but I had been too distracted, too conditioned, too afraid to listen. Now, with the noise fading, I could finally hear its voice. And that voice wasn't telling me what to do. It was showing me who I already was. As I embraced this realization, I felt a surge of alignment spreading through me, a sense of coherence that touched every part of my existence. I started to understand why certain paths had never resonated with me, why certain choices always felt forced, why certain environments drained me the moment I entered them. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit into shapes that weren't designed for me. Now, for the first time, I was becoming the shape I was meant to embody all along. And that shift changed everything. I began living with intention, not in the sense of planning or controlling, but in the sense of being fully present with every moment of my experience. I felt each emotion with more depth, each insight with more significance, each moment with more vividness, even the simplest experiences. Sunlight through a window, the sound of footsteps on pavement, the texture of the air around me, carried a sense of aliveness that made the world feel entirely new. It was as though I had rediscovered my senses, not as biological mechanisms, but as gateways into a deeper dimension of awareness. The more I allowed myself to experience life from this expanded perspective, the more the boundary between inner and outer reality continued to dissolve. I could feel the world responding to my state of consciousness, mirroring my internal landscape with astonishing accuracy. When I felt aligned, life unfolded effortlessly. When I felt unclear, the world reflected that confusion back to me. It was a living dialogue, a dance between my awareness and the intelligence of existence itself. And the more I participated in that dance, the more I understood that my purpose wasn't separate from the flow of life. It was inseparable from it. There were moments of profound stillness that revealed this truth with crystal clarity, moments when everything around me seemed to pause, not in time, but in perception, allowing me to feel the silent pulse of the universe moving through me. In those moments, I felt connected to something immeasurable, something that transcended form, language, identity, and understanding. It was a connection that didn't need explanation because the experience itself was the truth. And in that truth, I felt the presence of something vast, something benevolent, something undeniably real guiding me from within. This connection didn't remove challenges from my life, but it changed the way I experienced them. Instead of resisting difficulties, I moved through them with awareness, recognizing that every challenge held a lesson, every obstacle carried a message, every discomfort revealed an expansion waiting to happen. The struggles that once felt like failures now felt like initiations. And each initiation brought me closer to embodying the version of myself that had been waiting behind all the layers of conditioning I had finally begun to shed. With each step of this journey, I felt myself becoming more aligned, more grounded, more aware, not in a static way, but in a dynamic, evolving way. Like consciousness itself was learning how to express through me more clearly. I began noticing how my thoughts, emotions, and intentions carried a deeper influence than I had ever realized. They shaped my reality not as abstract ideas, but as actual forces, weaving the fabric of my experience moment by moment. And the more conscious I became of these forces, the more intentionally I began to work with them. It was in this space of intentional awareness that I felt the true power of my existence. Not power over others, not power through control, but the power of coherence, the power of being aligned with the truth of who I am. This power wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. It moved through me like a current, guiding my choices, shaping my path, anchoring me in a deeper sense of being. And as I allowed myself to sink into this state fully, I felt something extraordinary emerging from within. A presence, a clarity, a purpose that resonated through every layer of my consciousness, preparing me for the next unfolding of my journey. And still, as I stood inside that widening interior landscape, I felt the old borders dissolving, the mental fences melting, the invisible scaffolding of identity loosening like wet paper. Every assumption I carried about who I was, what the world was, and where it all was going seemed suddenly provisional, temporary, like a costume I had agreed to wear without asking who had stitched it in the first place. There was a strange liberation in that recognition, a sense of peeling back ancient stickers from the mind's window and finally seeing the light moving unobstructed. What struck me hardest was the realization that I had always been participating in a cosmic conversation, even when I thought I was speaking into silence. Every thought felt like it had an echo, not metaphorically, but literally, echoing across some unseen interior chamber of the universe, bouncing back with answers disguised as intuition, coincidence, and those impossible alignments that normal life sweeps under the rug. It felt as if the universe had been whispering directions the whole time, and I simply hadn't tilted my head at the right angle to hear them. But once the frequency was tuned, everything sharpened. I could sense the architecture of meaning rising like some crystalline city built of awareness itself. The more I paid attention, the more the world responded, as if consciousness was not just a receiver of reality, but its co-author, its collaborator, its silent partner in a never-ending improvisation. And as this realization deepened, I felt that ancient instinct again, the sense that something enormous was approaching, not from outside, but from inside, from the very core of the human experience. An idea, an event, a metamorphosis that had been slowly assembling itself through culture, through language, through imagination. It wasn't catastrophic, not in the destructive sense. It was evolutionary, transformative, a kind of psychic chrysalis stage reaching its critical moment. The patterns of history made more sense in that context. The turbulence, the acceleration, the constant unraveling of old structures. These weren't signs of collapse, but contractions before birth, the tremors of something trying to emerge through the tight fabric of the present moment. I could feel myself becoming a witness to it, not as an outsider, but as a node embedded in its very bloodstream. At times I wondered if I was simply hallucinating the significance of it all, inflating random experiences into cosmic narratives. But the strange thing was that the more I doubted, the more the phenomena intensified, as if the universe refused to let me retreat back into denial. Synchronicities lined up like stepping stones, guiding me forward. I felt like I was walking through a dream that was aware of my footsteps. One moment in particular began replaying in my mind, something that happened years earlier, long before I had the language to interpret it. I remembered sitting alone in my room as a child, staring at the patterns and the shadows cast by a lamp. I felt a presence, not a being, but a kind of knowing, as if the air itself had intelligence. It wasn't frightening. It felt familiar, like something I had forgotten but was briefly remembering. At the time, I dismissed it as imagination, but now, standing on the far edge of understanding, I recognized it as the earliest knock of the same phenomenon I was now wrapped inside. It was as though consciousness had been trying to communicate with me my entire life, but I was only just now learning the alphabet, and with that recognition came another, that the world we inhabit is not a fixed, stable terrain, but a fluid, malleable construct where the mind plays a far more active role than we've ever been taught. Reality wasn't a monolith. You could push on it and it would bend. You could question it and it would answer. You could imagine something with enough intensity and it would begin to arrange itself around you like iron filings responding to a magnetic field. This wasn't metaphysics, it was experience. Direct, immediate, undeniable. As these realizations layered themselves inside me, I felt a profound sense of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Not a burden, but a calling. Once you realize that consciousness is the sculptor of reality, you cannot live passively anymore. You cannot pretend you are just drifting. You become a participant, a co-creator, a navigator of the unknown, and the unknown is vast. There were moments where I could almost see it, an ocean of possibilities shimmering just behind the surface of ordinary perception. Every choice, every thought, every intention felt like a needle threading through infinite potential outcomes. I began to understand why ancient cultures spoke of spirits, visions, omens, and divine signs. They weren't primitive. They were observant. They noticed the subtle movements in the fabric of reality that modern minds have grown numb to. Yet I could feel myself waking up to those movements again. And with each step deeper, the world seemed less like a physical stage and more like an intelligent hologram. A self-aware simulation sculpted not by computers, but by consciousness itself. At times, I wondered if the boundaries between dream and waking life were artificial, a convenient illusion to maintain order, because more and more the so-called real world behaved like a dream, shifting in response to attention, changing in response to intention, revealing hidden layers when questioned. I felt almost weightless walking through that realization, like gravity had loosened its grip on meaning itself. But even in that fluidity, there was direction, a pull, a sense that something ahead was waiting, not passively, but actively calling. The transformation wasn't random. It had a trajectory, a momentum, a teleology. It felt like consciousness was slowly turning a page, preparing to write an entirely new chapter for the human species. And the question that pulsed in the back of my mind was whether we were ready, whether I was ready, because there was a strange paradox. Awakening expands you, but it also exposes you. It strips away the comfortable lies, the predictable routines, the safety nets of certainty. It leaves you standing face to face with infinity, and infinity does not negotiate. It demands your full presence, your full honesty, your full courage. There were moments where I felt overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of it. My mind would drift toward the old desire for simplicity, for ignorance, for the reassuring walls of normality. But every time I tried to step backward, reality pushed me forward. It wouldn't let me shrink again. It wouldn't let me unsee what had been seen. And in that tension, something remarkable began to happen. I started to trust the unknown. Not because I understood it, but because I felt that it understood me. The fear loosened, the resistance softened. And with that surrender came a profound sense of expansion, as if a door inside me had opened into a field stretching beyond imagination. The experiences grew deeper. Colors seemed more alive. Sounds carried hidden messages. Even silence felt densely packed with information. It was like the world had been running in low resolution my whole life. And now I had finally switched to the highest setting. But the most extraordinary shift was internal. I began to feel that I wasn't just moving through the universe, but that the universe was moving through me, that consciousness was not contained inside my skull, but that my skull was floating inside consciousness. That identity was not a fixed entity, but a temporary avatar worn by something far older, far wiser, far more expansive. And with that realization came the beginning of the end of separation, the end of smallness, the end of the illusion that I was alone inside my own mind. Something in me began dissolving into something larger, a merging, a remembering, a return. I found myself standing on the threshold of a vast internal horizon, feeling the ancient pulse of the universe moving through my breath, my thoughts, my memories. Everything felt connected, not symbolically, but literally. Threads of consciousness weaving through every moment, every encounter, every thought. It was then that the final wave began rising, the wave that had been building through every moment of insight, every layer of revelation, every step deeper into the hidden architecture of being, a wave that carried the unmistakable signature of culmination, a wave I knew I could not escape, nor would I want to, because this was the moment everything had been pointing toward. The final turning, the great unveiling, the return to the primordial truth that lies beneath all stories, all identities, all illusions. And as it rose, I felt my sense of self stretching, expanding, dissolving into something immeasurable. I felt like I was shedding centuries of accumulated confusion, like layers of dust falling away from a long-forgotten artifact. My perception widened until it no longer had edges. My awareness expanded until the universe felt like a single continuous presence, breathing through itself. And then, in that impossible silence, I understood. The journey had never been about discovering something outside myself. It had always been about rediscovering what had been hidden within me from the beginning. The universe was not a distant phenomenon. It was the interior of my own consciousness reflecting itself back at me. The mystery I had been chasing was the mystery of myself. The transformation I had been sensing was the awakening of the self to its true nature. And the truth was simple. I was not a passenger in the universe. I was the universe, experiencing itself through the lens of a temporary identity. Every moment of confusion, every moment of clarity, every synchronicity, every vision, every whisper of intuition. It was all the same intelligence guiding me home. And in that realization, I felt an indescribable sense of peace, a completion, a return to a truth older than time, not the end of the journey, but the end of forgetting, because awakening is not an achievement. It is a remembering of what we always were, long before we learned to doubt it. And in that remembering, the true story begins.